This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Monteverde Elephant. Now this ink sample leaked on its way to me, and I thought, well, possibly two of my samples have leaked because this one also has this teal bit, but on the tissue I've been using to clean up my ink drips, I put a few little drops of water and you can see some teal is coming out of this ink. You'll have to excuse my inky hands also. I also spilt this ink sample on my desk, but I was able to use an ink syringe to draw most of it back up and get it in my sample vial. So I've got about 1.5 mils left. So to test this ink, I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll also take a look at a writing sample that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper. I'll compare Monteverde Elephant to similar inks from my collection. And then finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Monteverde Elephant was pleasant to write with using a glass dip pen. And the swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp. The color of the swatch ranges from a dark purple, almost black, to a little bit lighter purple, but it's still pretty dark. The drip at the end of the swatch shows that this ink does not sheen. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. Alright, this ink feels very smooth in this extra fine nib, and normally I give the caveat that, well, it's smooth, but it's smooth compared to other extra fine nibs, but in this case it was just smooth on this Tomoe River paper. This is possibly one of the smoothest inks that I've used in this extra fine nib. And the legibility is also very good. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Pereira. It has a fine steel nib. The fine has a little bit broader line. The legibility is a little bit better. It's a little bit wetter, you can see from the ink smear. And normally when I go from the extra fine to the fine, I comment on, yeah, it definitely feels smoother. But in this case, these two felt similar. Both very smooth. The extra fine was just as smooth as the fine nib. Next, I've got a Monteverde Ripman pocket pen. It has a number 5 size Omniflex steel nib. A little bit of a hard start there. Okay, now the reason I wanted to try this ink with my Monteverde Ripman is I've only tried 2 inks with this. So one of the inks I had trouble with hard starting. The ink I used was Sailor Tokiwa Matsu. And I had trouble with hard starts because this nib has really long tines that extend out farther from the feed than most smaller nibs. Let me compare it to my 78G. See that? So this nib, if you're using an ink that tends to dry quickly on the nib, it will really dry quickly on this nib. So then I tried Diamine Earl Grey and it worked perfectly. So I was hoping with this lubricated Monteverde ink that I wouldn't have trouble with hard starts, and I didn't there. So I'm thinking, and I haven't had any trouble with the other writing samples I did. Like I'll do a writing sample and I'll put the pens away for an hour or so, then I'll come back and do more writing samples just to see if the ink is going to have some issues like drying out. But I'm going to go ahead and say this is nice. I didn't have any issues previously, and I only had that one little tiny hard start. Now this nib, I love this nib. It has a little bit of a stubby nature to it, though I don't notice it on this paper as much, which is surprising. I did a writing sample on my Rhodia paper, which has larger grids and is a little more absorbent than this Tomoe River, and I love how the ink looks on that paper. This nib is just a little bit too broad for my taste for these little grids. Next, I've got a Caveco Perceo. It has a stainless steel medium nib. Very nice and velvety in this nib, and you can't tell by the ink swat or the ink smear there, but this feels a little bit drier and it looks a little bit drier. I'm seeing more of the medium purple shade, and whereas the Monteverde Ripman, it's looking like it's mostly this darker shade. This is very smooth. Next, I've got my Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. Very smooth, even though this nib writes quite a bit drier. Still very smooth and pleasant, and because it writes drier, again, I'm seeing more of the kind of dusky medium purple. Because this is such a dark ink, even though it's putting down less ink, it doesn't look pale and washed out. It doesn't look anemic. It looks nice. Next, I've got a Caveco Lily Put. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This is nice, very smooth, of course. There aren't many inks that aren't smooth and enjoyable to use in this Caveco broad nib. But where I'm normally commenting on how luxurious the ink feels in this nib, it feels nice, but I don't like the way the ink looks, and that's just a personal preference to me. I guess with darker inks like this, inks that aren't bright maybe, I'm not sure. I just don't prefer this broader nib. I think it looks better in the medium and fine nibs. Next, I've got a Hound X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. Again, as usual, this nib is nice and wet and feels very smooth, but it's just a personal preference with me. I prefer the medium and fine nibs. I guess this ink is so dark that when you have this wet of a nib, you just lose some of the character of the ink. But it is very smooth and enjoyable to write with. While that dries, I'm going to take a look at the copy paper. Now my writing sample on 20-pound copy paper was very enjoyable also. You can see that it's a very quick drying ink. It soaks into the paper instantly, and I would draw the X and wipe my finger across it and no smear at all. Each of these pens and inks were enjoyable to use. The only one that was not pleasant was the Caveco Percale, and if you look closely at the letters, it would feel too wet and too dry, too wet, too dry, too wet and too dry. The ink flow was just, I said the ink flow was inconsistent, but what I think was happening in this absorbent paper and this lubricated ink, the paper would just pull it out of the pen, and it took a little while for the feed to catch up, and it was just that way with every word. Too wet, too dry. But everything else felt really nice. Even my fine nibs, again, on this copy paper, really enjoyable to write with. On the back of the paper, it was about average if you compare it to the other inks. In fact, it was a little bit better than the Diamine Polar Glow when it comes to bleed through. But I want to go ahead and show my writing sample that I did on Rhodia. On the back, there were just little dots here and there of bleed through. Nothing that would keep you from using the back of the page, but I just thought it was interesting because that's unusual for Rhodia paper for the ink to bleed through, but this is a purple ink, and in my experience those tend to be the ones that are more prone to bleeding through the page. I might as well go ahead and show the writing sample in my Leuchtturm. I've got Noodler's Cactus Fruit Eel and Diamine Polar Glow, and you can see on Monteverde Elephant it's coming through the page. Noodler's Cactus Fruit Eel, I'm not seeing anything, and on Polar Glow there was just a little bit where it wanted to come through, but there's a couple of purples on this page. Yeah, Waterman got pretty deep into the paper, so that's just something I've noticed. Purple inks have a tendency to bleed through otherwise fountain pen friendly paper. When I picked this ink out, I thought this was going to be like a dark gray ink with just a little bit of purple to it, but it turns out it's more of just a straight dark purple ink. The closest thing I had to it in my collection was Herbin Poussière de Lune, and you can see it's much lighter and much more red, but it shares that characteristic of it shades from dark to kind of a medium color. I pulled out Ferris Wheel Press Grape Ice Pop because it's similar to Poussière de Lune, but you can see we're getting farther away from Monteverde Elephant. It doesn't have much in terms of shading. It doesn't have those darker tones like the Monteverde Elephant and the Poussière de Lune. When I picked this ink out, I thought it would be more like Diamine Earl Grey. Diamine Earl Grey is a pretty complex gray ink, but this is more of a straight up purple. It behaves very similarly to Monteverde Burgundy. You can see they shade pretty dark, and Monteverde Burgundy is a joy to use in the pen. It behaves very well like Monteverde Elephant. I submerged this writing sample with Monteverde Elephant into water for 10 minutes, and the only thing I saw coming up was this same purple that is left behind. I think the longer you leave it in water, the more of this purple is going to come up, and that's why it was such a surprise to see this teal component. It got pretty deep into the paper on the heavy parts, like the end of the swatch and the wetter nibs, and you've got a decent amount of show through because this is such a dark ink, but in just normal writing, there's no danger of it bleeding through. My favorite pen to use with this ink in all of the writing samples was the Ripman pocket pen. However, on this Tomoe River paper, it was my least favorite paper. I'm going to pull up the Rhodia paper again so you can see how stubby and crisp the lines are, and my writing had much more of a stub-like character to it. I really like it on this paper. But on the Tomoe River paper, I have to say, if I want a broader line, I like the Pluminix. You see just a little bit of shading, just some to give your writing a little bit of character. And I liked the Pereira. It's very easy on the eyes when reading it back, and it was really smooth for a fine nib. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.